August 18, 1966. The battle was won perfectly. Every order was carried out as trained. Every movement aligned with doctrine. Every man did what wars are supposedly won by. And that was the problem. In the early hours after the fighting ended, the rain still falling like it had no memory of what it had just witnessed, the ground told a simple story. Bodies lay where they had fallen, uniforms soaked dark, weapons half buried in mud. Rubber trees stood shredded and scarred, their neat rows broken by shell craters and snapped trunks. By any measurable standard, it was a victory. The numbers were already forming in men's minds before the reports were written. Enemy dead counted in the hundreds, friendly losses painfully small by comparison. Ratios that would look impressive on a briefing slide. Ratios that would travel well. Thousands of miles away, in rooms far from the smell of cordite and wet earth, those numbers would be all that mattered. Officers would lean over maps, fingers tracing arrows, voices calm and confident as they explained progress. Charts would be adjusted. Pins moved slightly forward. Another successful engagement added to the ledger. Another reason to believe the strategy was sound. Colonel Richard Halvorsen stood in one of those rooms weeks later, jacket pressed, ribbons aligned, listening as a young staff officer spoke with practiced precision. The words were clean, clinical, kill ratios.
Ennemi formation disrupted.
Friendly forces demonstrating effectiveness. Halvorsen nodded along with the others, because nodding was expected. He had learned long ago when to speak and when to let numbers do the talking. He had been in the field once, long enough to know that numbers were shadows of reality, not reality itself. He remembered the look in a private's eyes when the shooting stopped, the way hands shook long after danger passed. None of that ever made it into reports. Fear didn't fit into columns. Exhaustion couldn't be graphed. Doubt had no place in a briefing. The general at the front of the room cleared his throat and smiled thinly. Engagements like this show the strategy is working, he said. Aggressive contact. Superior firepower. Measurable progress. The room murmured its agreement. Victories had to mean something. They always had to mean something. Careers depended on it. Policies depended on it. So did the justification for sending more men into places they couldn't pronounce. Halvorsen thought of the plantation, of how the fight had not unfolded the way doctrine said it should have, even though every rule had been followed, of how survival had come not from movement or extraction, but from staying still when everything screamed to run. That part would never be emphasized. Complicated the story. Outside the room, protesters gathered behind barricades, holding signs and shouting words that echoed faintly through thick walls. Inside, the war was tidy, logical, a sequence of wins adding up to an inevitable conclusion. The belief was comforting. If battles were being won, then the war itself must be moving toward victory. But Halvorsen knew something was wrong. If winning battles truly meant winning wars, then this one should already be over. Too many victories had piled up with too little to show for them. The numbers kept improving, yet the horizon never got closer. He glanced at the map again, at the colored pins marking progress that somehow never arrived. For a brief moment, the room fell quiet as the general paused between sentences. In that silence, an uncomfortable thought surfaced, one nobody wanted to voice. What if the victories weren't pointing forward at all? What if they were pointing inward, exposing a flaw no amount of success could fix? The general resumed speaking, the moment passed, and the room exhaled. The lie held not because it was true, but because it was necessary. And somewhere, in a quiet rubber plantation slowly returning to green, the earth absorbed the rain and kept the secret that numbers never could. They were ordinary men before the war decided otherwise. Farmers' sons, mechanics, students who had learned to march and shoot because someone told them it mattered. In the plantation, there was no talk of strategy, no thought of politics or progress charts. There was only weight, of rifles dragging on shoulders, of soaked uniforms clinging to skin, of minutes stretching too long while waiting for something to happen. Corporal Daniel Mercer wiped rain from his eyes with the back of his hand and focused on the space between two trees, not because it was important in some grand sense, but because it was his responsibility. He did not know where the battle would be discussed later, or how it would be described. He knew only that if something moved there, he was expected to stop it. Around him, men breathed too fast, then forced themselves to slow down. Training took over where thought became dangerous. They trusted routines because routines didn't ask questions. No one spoke about winning. No one spoke about meaning. They spoke in hand signals and clipped words, checking ammunition, nudging each other back into position when spacing drifted. Somewhere beyond the trees, an enemy they could not see was making plans of his own. Somewhere far away, men in offices believed they understood what was happening here. But in the rain and mud, none of that existed. There were no theories, no doctrines, no illusions, only men doing exactly what they had been taught, unaware that their obedience and competence were about to reveal a truth far larger than any of them could see. Everything they were about to do violated the rules that were supposed to keep them alive. Every lecture they had sat through, every diagram drawn on chalkboards back home, every confident assurance that modern warfare had solved the old problems, none of it fit the ground they were standing on now. Doctrine assumed clarity. This place offered none. Doctrine assumed movement. Here, movement invited death. Doctrine assumed communication flowed upward and orders flowed down. In the rain-soaked plantation, radios spat static and silence in equal measure, and waiting for permission felt like waiting to be overrun. The manual said that when contact grew heavy, you disengaged. You called for extraction. You traded space for time and let machines do the killing. Helicopters would lift you out, artillery would pulverize what you left behind, and the war would continue somewhere else. That logic worked on paper and in clear skies. It worked when distance could be created on demand. It worked when the battlefield obeyed the assumptions built into the plan. But the plantation didn't care about assumptions. The rain pinned them in place as effectively as the enemy did. The ground sucked at their boots. Visibility collapsed into narrow tunnels between rows of trees. To pull back now wouldn't be a maneuver. It would be a scramble, men moving blind under fire, turning discipline into panic. Sergeant Alan Foster understood this without articulating it. He had been trained well enough to know what the correct response was supposed to be, and experienced enough to know when correctness no longer applied. He crouched behind a tree, feeling bullets thud into the trunk, feeling the vibration through the wood and into his chest. He waited, not because waiting was doctrine, but because it was the only thing that made sense. Around him, his section mirrored the stillness. No shouting, no wasted movement, just eyes tracking lanes of approach, fingers steady on triggers. Fire discipline was another rule being quietly broken, or perhaps more accurately reinterpreted. Modern war preached volume. Suppress, overwhelm, dominate. Fire was meant to be constant, noisy, reassuring in its abundance. But abundance was a myth here. Ammunition was finite, heavy, already soaked through. Every magazine felt lighter than it should. Foster counted shots without meaning to, a habit drilled into him years ago and never erased. One shot. Pause. Another. Men fired when they saw something worth killing, not when fear told them to. The rhythm was deliberate, almost calm, and entirely at odds with the idea that survival came from putting as much lead into the air as possible. Somewhere to the rear, an officer tried to raise higher command. The radio answered with static. Words arrived broken, half-formed, stripped of urgency by interference. Centralized control depended on clarity, and clarity was gone. So authority fragmented, not out of rebellion, but necessity. Corporals made decisions that would normally belong to captains. Lieutenants acted without confirmation. Each small group became its own island, linked to the others by trust rather than constant instruction. The war shrank to the distance a man could see and the space he was responsible for holding. Holding ground was the greatest violation of all. Everything in modern thinking said you didn't do this unless you had overwhelming force or prepared defenses. You didn't stand still in the open against superior numbers. You didn't accept being fixed in place. Yet that was exactly what was happening. The line settled, imperfect and uneven, shaped by terrain rather than intention. Men dug where they could, scraped shallow positions in mud that refused to cooperate. They weren't building fortifications. They were building resolve inch by inch, deciding that this place, unremarkable, nameless to most of the world, would not be given up easily. The irony was that none of this felt heroic. Felt uncomfortable, wrong, even. Men trained to move now clung to stillness. Men told that speed saved lives now relied on patience. The confidence that came from having options evaporated, replaced by the stark clarity of having none. Stay and fight or move and die faster. The choice made itself. As the engagement intensified, the contrast between assumption and reality sharpened. Modern warfare promised control through technology, yet technology faltered first. Radios failed. Air support vanished behind clouds and rain. What remained were fundamentals older than the machines. Sightlines, fields of fire, trust between men who knew each other's habits. The plantation's neat rows, planted decades earlier for profit, became accidental corridors of death. Old-fashioned concepts, overlapping fire, mutual support, suddenly mattered more than anything written in recent manuals. Private Thomas Reed, barely old enough to have formed opinions about war at all, felt this shift without understanding it. He had been taught that chaos was something you managed by following procedures. Now chaos felt managed by instinct. He watched his section commander choose targets calmly, never raising his voice, never firing unless necessary. It didn't look like the war Reed had imagined from training films and stories. It looked slower, quieter, deadlier. Each pause between shots carried weight, as if the silence itself was part of the weapon. Independence bred responsibility, and responsibility sharpened focus. Without constant orders, mistakes couldn't be blamed upward. Every decision belonged to the man who made it. That knowledge settled heavily, but it also clarified priorities. There was no room for confusion about objectives. Hold the space. Protect the men beside you. Keep firing lanes clear. Everything else was noise. What doctrine had promised, safety through systems, reality replaced with something more fragile but more adaptable. Judgment, experience, the willingness to trust that the man next to you would do his part without being told. In this environment, centralized control would have slowed reactions to the point of uselessness. Independence was not a philosophy here. It was survival. The strangest part was how quickly it all felt normal. Within minutes, perhaps less, the idea of calling for extraction faded into irrelevance. No one spoke the word retreat, not because it was forbidden but because it no longer applied. The line existed. It held because men believed it could. That belief, unquantifiable and unteachable in any formal sense, became as important as ammunition. This collision between doctrine and reality did not announce itself with revelation or clarity. It crept in quietly, through small choices made under pressure. A decision to wait instead of move. A decision to aim instead of spray. A decision to act without asking. Each choice contradicted something written somewhere, yet each choice felt undeniably correct in the moment it was made. Later, analysts would argue about what mattered most: training, leadership, discipline. They would debate whether these actions represented innovation or stubbornness. On the ground, none of that existed yet. There was only the sense that the rules had changed without warning, and the only way to survive was to adapt faster than the enemy expected. As the firing continued and the rain refused to let up, the men settled fully into this unwanted truth. Modern assumptions had promised simplicity. Reality delivered complexity. Old methods, thought obsolete, proved resilient. Not because they were superior in theory, but because they aligned with the conditions no theory could fully anticipate. By holding ground when they were told to move, by firing less when they were taught to fire more, by deciding locally when systems failed, they were not making a statement. They were responding honestly to the situation in front of them. And in doing so, they began to reveal a dangerous implication, one that would only become clear later, far from the mud and rain. If survival required breaking the rules meant to ensure it, then perhaps those rules had been built for a different war altogether. This is what competence looks like when there is no margin for error. Not confidence, not bravado, not the loud certainty of men who believe the outcome favors them, but a quieter discipline that strips action down to essentials. Under pressure that never relents, calm becomes a skill as tangible as marksmanship. Men breathe deliberately not because they feel steady, but because they know panic wastes time. Orders are short, often unspoken. A glance, a raised hand, a slight shift in posture is enough. Each man understands not just his role, but the shape of the ground around him and how his fire fits into the larger pattern. Nothing overlaps by accident. Nothing is left uncovered by chance. The firing is measured, almost restrained, despite the chaos pressing in from every direction. Rifles crack in a steady rhythm, not the frantic roar of men trying to drown out fear, but the controlled cadence of intent. Machine guns speak when they must, then fall silent to conserve heat and ammunition. Every burst has a purpose. Every pause is deliberate. The enemy advances in numbers that should overwhelm, bodies appearing between the trees in waves that test the nerves as much as the line. But the line doesn't respond emotionally. It responds mechanically. Targets appear. Targets fall. The process repeats with brutal efficiency. Small units operate as if cut from the same mind. When one section draws heavier pressure, the adjacent one adjusts without being told, shifting fire, tightening angles, closing gaps before they can be exploited. No one waits for permission to act. There isn't time. Authority flows downward and outward, not because hierarchy has collapsed, but because trust has replaced it. Each man knows the others are watching, covering, compensating. That knowledge steadies hands more effectively than any shouted encouragement. Psychological collapse is always the real enemy in fights like this. Bullets kill bodies, but fear dissolves structure. Here, structure holds. Men acknowledge danger without dramatizing it. Wounds are treated quickly, efficiently, without ceremony. Pain is deferred. Loss is noted and set aside. Grief has no place yet. Survival requires focus, and focus becomes contagious. Even those who feel themselves nearing the edge find stability in the behavior of the men beside them. Calm spreads the way panic often does, silently and decisively. The enemy presses harder, probing for weakness, expecting the inevitable moment when discipline fractures. It doesn't come. The defense bends where it must, contracts where pressure increases, but it never dissolves. This is not stubbornness. It is precision under strain. The kind of performance that looks unremarkable to anyone not inside it because nothing flashy happens. There is no dramatic charge, no sudden reversal. Just competence applied relentlessly, denying the enemy the chaos they rely on to break resistance. Then the cost of that perfection begins to surface. Ammunition counts are checked again and again, each time with growing unease. Magazines that once felt heavy now sit uncomfortably light in webbing. Machine gun belts shorten. Men glance at one another, exchanging looks that ask questions without voicing them. How much longer? How much do we really have left? The firing continues, but the spaces between shots lengthen slightly, not from hesitation, but from necessity. Every round now carries weight far beyond its mass. The enemy senses it. They always do. Distance closes more aggressively. Shapes move faster between trees, closer than before, close enough now that faces can be seen in brief flashes of light. Grenades arc through the air, dull thuds shaking the ground. Shrapnel cuts bark and flesh alike. The fight compresses, the space shrinking until it feels as though the entire battle could be contained within a few desperate meters. Every rule says this is the moment you withdraw. This is when doctrine demands movement, when survival is supposed to come from breaking contact and escaping the trap before it tightens further. The rational choice is clear. Staying risks encirclement. Staying risks annihilation. Staying risks everything. They stay. Not because they believe they are invincible. Not because they think retreat is cowardice. They stay because moving now would cost more lives than holding. Because the line, thin and strained as it is, still exists. Because as long as it exists, it can be defended. Men sink lower into the mud, making themselves smaller, harder to see. Fire tightens, becomes even more selective. Shots are taken at distances measured in heartbeats rather than meters. The pressure builds toward something that feels inevitable. A breaking point, a scream, a rush, something. Instead, there is only endurance. The line flexes but does not give way. Men speak less now, conserving breath, conserving thought. Muscles burn. Hands cramp. Time loses coherence, measured only by the next reload, the next advance repelled, the next moment survived. In those minutes, when retreat remains an option in theory but not in practice, something settles into place. A shared understanding that this ground will be held not because it is valuable, but because abandoning it would unravel everything else. Each man knows that if he runs, someone else dies. If he holds, there is at least a chance. The enemy closes again, closer than before, testing the last reserves of discipline. The response is immediate, coordinated, devastating. Fire erupts precisely where it is needed, no more, no less. The attack falters, then collapses inward on itself, bodies falling into the same narrow lanes they had advanced through moments earlier. When the pressure finally eases, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like survival is postponed. Men remain in position, weapons trained outward, unwilling to trust the quiet. They have learned not to confuse pauses with endings. Ammunition is redistributed where possible, hands passing magazines in silence. Eyes remain fixed on the darkness ahead. The line that should have broken did not because it was held together by something stronger than rules or optimism. It held because competence, applied without illusion, refused to yield to fear. And in that refusal, something else was proven, something that would only be understood later, far from the sound of gunfire. By every metric used in Washington, this was a triumph. When the firing finally thinned and then stopped altogether, the change felt unreal. The rain continued, indifferent, washing smoke from the air and blood into the soil. Men stayed frozen in position long after the last shots, weapons raised, eyes burning from strain, unwilling to believe the enemy had truly gone. Then the realization settled in slowly, almost reluctantly. The pressure had lifted. The shapes no longer moved. The jungle had swallowed the attackers the way it always did. Suddenly, completely, leaving behind only what could not run. The ground in front of the line told the story with brutal clarity. Bodies lay scattered where advances had failed, clustered in the narrow lanes between trees, collapsed behind trunks that offered no protection against disciplined fire. Weapons lay abandoned in the mud. Blood pooled in shell craters already filled with rainwater. The enemy had come in strength and left in pieces. There was no ambiguity about the outcome. The line still existed. The ground was still held. The men were still standing. Casualties were counted carefully, methodically, because that was what came next after survival. Friendly losses were heavy enough to hurt, light enough to justify the decisions made. Enemy losses were staggering by comparison. The ratios were extraordinary. Numbers that would be repeated later with a tone of approval, as if arithmetic itself could confer meaning. In any operational analysis, this engagement would be labeled decisive. The enemy had withdrawn. The objective, whatever it had been defined as, had been achieved. By the standards used to judge progress, nothing more could reasonably be asked of the men who fought there. No one celebrated. There was no cheering, no sense of accomplishment beyond a dull, exhausted relief. Wounded men were tended to. The dead were laid out with care, their faces suddenly young again in stillness. Ammunition was redistributed, weapons checked, positions maintained. Victory, when it arrived, felt administrative. A condition noted rather than enjoyed. The fight had been won, but it did not feel finished. It felt contained, sealed off, as though the jungle had merely closed a chapter rather than ended a story. Days later, when reports moved up the chain, the language changed. The mud and rain fell away, replaced by clean sentences and precise figures. Engagement successful. Enemy forces repelled. Favorable kill ratio. Ground held. Each phrase carried confidence. Each implied momentum. The fight became a data point, stripped of fear, stripped of improvisation, stripped of the uncomfortable fact that survival had depended on doing things the manuals did not encourage. In the briefing room, the battle existed only as symbols on a map and numbers on a page. Generals stood straight-backed, voices steady as they explained outcomes to men who would never smell the plantation or hear the rain drown out gunfire. The presentation flowed smoothly. Questions were answered before they were asked. This was the kind of engagement that was reassuring. It fits the narrative. Aggressive contact had produced results. Superior forces had prevailed. The strategy once again appeared justified. What mattered wasn't what happened. It was what the numbers allowed them to believe. Metrics replaced meaning with remarkable efficiency. Kill ratios became proxies for success. Withdrawals became defeats. Survival became proof of doctrine rather than adaptation in spite of it. The men who had stayed when doctrine said move were absorbed into a story that suggested they had done exactly what was expected all along. Credit flowed upward and outward, attaching itself to plans and policies rather than individuals and decisions made under fire. There was little appetite for complication. Complication raised questions, and questions threatened coherence. The war required coherence to function at scale. Strategies could not hinge on exceptions. Doctrine could not be rewritten every time reality refused to cooperate. So the battle was folded neatly into existing assumptions, its sharper edges sanded down until it fit. In one such room, quieter than most, Richard Nixon listened. He did not speak at first. He had learned long ago the value of silence, especially when others were eager to fill it. He had worn a uniform once, served long enough to understand that wars were not won in briefing rooms, but they could be lost there. As the general spoke, he studied the map, the arrows, the confident language that suggested inevitability. He asked a few questions. Not many. Where were the helicopters? Why hadn't they extracted it? How had the line held under that kind of pressure? The answers came quickly, rehearsed, technically correct, and strategically hollow. Weather, circumstances, exceptional performance. Nothing that challenged the framework itself. Someone mentioned the Allies, almost as an aside. Their discipline, their stubbornness. The fact that they had stayed when doctrine suggested withdrawal. Nixon leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, not in anger but in recognition. He understood the paradox immediately because it was not unique to this war. History was full of them. Battles won in ways that revealed uncomfortable truths. Victories that asked the wrong questions. The battle didn't prove the strategy worked. Proved it didn't. He didn't say it loudly. He didn't need to. The words, spoken plainly, cut through the room more effectively than any raised voice. For a moment, no one responded. Not because they disagreed, but because agreement carried consequences no one was prepared to accept. To acknowledge the implication was to admit that success on the ground was not translating upward. That excellence was compensating for flaws it could not fix. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with discomfort. Eyes dropped back to papers. Pens moved. Someone cleared my throat. The moment passed, as moments like that often do, absorbed by the machinery of continuity. The strategy remained intact, not because it had been validated, but because dismantling it would have required more courage than anyone present was willing to spend. Outside, the war continued unchanged. More engagements, more numbers, more victories that looked convincing from a distance. The battle receded into history as an example of success, its deeper meaning buried beneath layers of interpretation designed to protect the story that had already been decided. And somewhere, far from the maps and metrics, men who had held the line carried on, knowing only that they had survived something that should have killed them, and that whatever they had proven that day, it was not what the war would remember. The lesson was written in blood. It was filed away. After the reports were archived and the briefings concluded, the machinery resumed its rhythm. Doctrine did not shatter under the weight of evidence. It absorbed it, diluted it, and moved on. Thick binders appeared with lessons identified, observations noted, recommendations deferred. Language softened what reality had made sharp. Words like context-specific, exceptional circumstances, not broadly applicable, created a safe distance between what had happened and what might need to change. The institution had learned how to survive contradiction long before it learned how to resolve it. Doctrine, by design, is conservative. It exists to standardize behavior across thousands of men who will never meet, in conditions planners can only approximate. To bend too easily is to risk chaos. To change too slowly is to risk irrelevance. Faced with that tension, institutions almost always choose stability. The cost of that choice is paid elsewhere. Not in offices, not in conferences, on the ground. Soldiers adapted because they had to. Adaptation was immediate, local, and unforgiving. A bad assumption corrected itself quickly when it got someone killed. A good adjustment spread wordlessly, picked up by others who recognized its value. This kind of learning left no paper trail. It didn't wait for approval. It didn't ask whether it aligned with doctrine. It worked or it didn't. Survival was the metric. The institution could not move that fast even if it wanted to. Every change rippled outward, threatening procurement, training pipelines, command structures built over years. To admit that a small unit in a forgotten plantation had solved a problem the system had not was to invite uncomfortable questions. If they were right, what else was wrong? If this worked here, why wasn't it the foundation everywhere? And if the foundation was flawed, what did that say about everything built on top of it? So the system compromised with itself. Praised courage without examining methods. It celebrated outcomes without interrogating causes. It absorbed the story as validation rather than warning. The battle became an example of success instead of a challenge to assumptions. The bureaucracy outlived the evidence because it was designed to. Men who had fought carried forward a different kind of knowledge. It showed in how they moved later, how they watched the ground, and how they trusted silence more than noise. Some of that knowledge filtered upward, slowly, unevenly, often stripped of its original context. Most of it didn't. It remained with them, lodged alongside memories they would never fully dislodge. They adapted. The institution remained largely the same. Wars do not end because lessons are learned. They end because costs become unbearable or objectives collapse. In this case, neither happened quickly enough. The machine kept turning. Engagements followed familiar patterns. Numbers continued to look convincing. And the gap between what worked tactically and what made sense strategically widened with every success that failed to accumulate into progress. That gap is where the cruelest truth about war lies. You can fight perfectly and still lose. You can execute every order with precision, make every decision under pressure correctly, and still serve a mission that cannot succeed on its own terms. Courage can delay failure. Skill can mask it. Discipline can make it survivable for a time. None of them can fix an incoherent strategy. This is the part no victory parade ever acknowledges. The part that unsettles rather than inspires. Soldiers are trained to believe that excellence matters. And it does, but not always in the way they are told. Excellence can become insulation, protecting flawed ideas from scrutiny by making their consequences manageable. When good men compensate for bad assumptions, failure takes longer to reveal itself. The men who held that line did not lose. They did everything asked of them and more. They proved what disciplined infantry could accomplish against impossible odds. They proved that calm, coordination, and refusal to collapse could defeat superior numbers. They proved how to fight. What they could not prove, what no single battle ever can, is how to win a war whose purpose is unclear and whose strategy mistakes persistence for progress. Their success exposed a contradiction too large for bravery to resolve. It showed that tactical brilliance, no matter how pure, cannot redeem a mission built on faulty premises. That is why the memory endures uneasily. Why it inspires pride and grief in equal measure. Why it resists neat conclusions. The jungle reclaimed the ground. The institution preserved itself. The men carried on with knowledge that would not be fully acknowledged until long after it was useful.